Welcome to Altus Insights podcast series with Ray and Marlon, hosted by me, Avi. This podcast will cover monthly market updates and construction cost impacts across major markets in Canada.
Well, hello, welcome to yet another really interesting podcast. You may have noticed that each time I have to wear a different t-shirt, which is inspired by Johannes in our marketing department. He basically acts as the Secret Service marketing person, making sure Ray don't say anything too controversial and get us in trouble, and that all our texts and Teams messages are deleted afterwards. So today's topic is interesting, somewhat controversial, and it's an oxymoron. Inclusionary zoning and affordable housing in Toronto. So inclusionary zoning, what is it? On the city website, these basically say, I'm going to read this. The City of Toronto has adopted an inclusionary zoning policy that will create new residential developments to include affordable housing units, creating mixed income housing. Our city is growing, and we want to make sure new housing is affordable for those who call Toronto home. So this version of IZ basically pushes the cost of affordable housing onto the market side of it. That seems to be the way it's going, but we'll discuss that in a moment. So I think we should start questioning the city having any form of credibility or intent around making housing affordable. So what is IZ? In essence, it's a phasing approach with any application for SPA after September 18th of this year. Starts off painful for condo from day one, and then by January 1st, 2026, we start to make purposeful rental less feasible. It's already not looking great. And by 2030, we basically have little or no development left if we carry on in this process. So each step adds a percentage of affordable requirement, either rental or ownership, gives nothing back in return, zero incentives, starts at 10% on the ownership side, eventually hits 22%, and for rental, it goes at about 5% at the top end. There are different areas or zones, 1, 2, and 3, and each of them has a slightly different requirement based on the base level of affordability in the first place. The good news is, though, inclusionary zoning is likely to help construction costs. They're likely to come under control in that once inclusionary zoning starts having an impact in the market, we're going to have nothing left to build. Bad news is price of tenants are likely to go up. Honestly, I think at this point, which is probably a bad introduction because we're sort of indicating what we're going to talk about, I think Monty Python has struggled to write a sketch as good as the approach to inclusionary zoning in Toronto if they actually put effort into it. So as I said, today's topic's a little controversial. To help us along the way, we have Ray, who's basically taking a break from his world tour and professional golf circuit. There's a rumor Live Golf offered him $10 to move over, and he turned it down because he likes doing the podcast too much. And we have the more sensible guest this week, who's the guy who's looking nice and uncomfortable now because I made too many inappropriate jokes. And that's the myth and the legend in the GTA when it comes to all things residential land. We've got John Galluzzo with us. So John, do you want to say hello, give a quick introduction to yourself as this is your first podcast?
Sure. And thank you for having me, Marlon and Ray. I'm glad to be here. Yes. So I've been with Altus since 2015 and managed the land valuation practice here. We've had a phenomenal ride thus far in terms of both land valuation activity and project valuation activity. You know, up until late with the most recent increases to DCs, the IZ coming around the corner, and of course, interest rates having a major impact on our industry. It'll be interesting to see the net result over the next 6 to 12 months in terms of actual impact to the land development industry in Toronto.
So in the introduction, obviously, I gave my view on inclusionary zoning. You may have got the hint I'm not overly a fan of inclusionary zoning with nothing actually being given back to inspire it or enabling it. What do you think the impact on inclusionary zoning is going to be on the overall development market in the City of Toronto?
I think there's going to be very little impact in the sense that we're not going to see any IZ units for at least 5 or 6 years. And the reason for that was the astute developers already started getting their chess pieces in order in 2021 and even earlier in terms of pushing forward their development applications and site plan applications on land holdings that they had in inventory and effectively have grandfathered themselves, thereby not requiring to provide any type of affordable housing or IZ defined housing since they've made it in time prior to the September 18th cutoff of this year. And if you ask any planning consultant in the city, they've all been working overtime for the last 2 years, pushing forward these development applications and site plan applications. And if you look at the number of units that have been effectively submitted in terms of complete development applications. There are thousands and thousands of units now that have been grandfathered. So effectively, if we could say that in the Toronto market, the best years we can build out 25,000 apartment suites, we effectively have enough supply for the next 5 to 7 years, at least, if not more, in terms of development applications. So the earliest this is just a gut feeling that I have, unless we're able to increase the productivity level of constructing these units, which I haven't seen thus far, we're not going to see any IZ units for at least 8 to 10 years. And effectively, unfortunately, that's going to hurt supply, not help supply.
So in essence, the unprecedented number of applications just means all inclusionary zoning did was inspire every person to throw in applications as quickly as humanly possible, which actually is likely to result in no affordable units in the mid to short term. And then in the long term, it's damaging because then it impacts the development market in the longer term in that it makes it less viable in theory.
Correct.
So right now then, if IZ is probably not the biggest issue in the market, what would you say is the biggest issue right now in terms of the midterm? It's probably interest rates versus, say, TGS, IZ. I know DCs and stuff, but would you say the interest rates is the bigger impact right now or bigger concern in the short midterm?
Without a doubt. Without a doubt. We're seeing it. Investors have gone into hiding. Condo investors have gone into hiding because the numbers don't pencil out. Purpose-built rental projects have been canceled, partly because construction costs have gone through the roof, not solely interest rates. The institutional funds are not as impacted by higher interest rates as, call it, high net worth families that may have an existing apartment portfolio and are looking to expand that by building new product out. So I think the interest rates is definitely the biggest impact to land development in the city, over and above the impact from IZ.
It's interesting with, and John made comments regards to the investors and with the recent increase with the Bank of Canada, agree that there is, anytime you see that type of change in the marketplace, you see a bit of a pause for people to sort of, what does this mean with the existing portfolio? What does it mean with pending transactions or things they're looking at? So the challenge, what we have, and John alluded to this, is that we really haven't seen the impact on values yet because of some of the transactions that haven't taken place yet. But there's definitely a bit of a hesitation from an investor standpoint based on these changes and based on the future profitability on some of the sites. So right off the bat, with any new projects without an application in place, we'll have a bit of a discount to it just because of they can't realize certain, based on the price of the land, certain returns that they're expecting on projects. So the challenge, what we're going to have here, and I'm on the same line as John, that it's going to cause that pause in the marketplace. And even though prior to this, there was quite a bit of activity, especially with some of the office buildings that were going to be redeveloped into residential condo or multi-purpose multifamily rentals. So we're seeing a pause in all those areas, and definitely that typically with land, developers like to land bank down the road. But the challenge with the IZ is that it creates a certain amount of uncertainty on returns down the road.
So it's basically creating a risk environment, but the short-term impact is more likely to be the interest rates. And I know the theory in the background reports were all that eventually that this will all correct itself out. Land prices might correct in theory to do it. But realistically, I think the general consensus seems to be that basically the market homes are going to be paying for the inclusionary zoning ultimately, especially if this is a mid to long-term issue versus short-term. So isn't it kind of the opposite effect of what the policy intended, in that 95% or 90% of the people have to pay for everyone else's affordable housing in theory? Or am I misunderstanding it?
Yeah, I'll take that one. And effectively, today, if you're going to run a pro forma, the value of the density that's apportioned to the inclusionary zoning would likely be a negative number. But given the lack of recent transactions that we know will be impacted by IZ, we haven't had third-party market support to justify what that impact would be. So for now, the IZ density has a zero value effectively. And in that assumption, we're assuming that the market density will absorb any of the shortfall that will be taken, that the developers will take from that 7 to 10% of IZ. And because the developers have the opportunity to choose the tenure of the IZ, i.e. tenure being ownership or rental, the city is providing incentives for rental because the percentage allocation for rental tenure is lower. So I would believe that the astute developers in the city would elect to do the rental tenure, and they can sell off those units to investors, to a third-party investor after. Marlon, but to answer your question, I think in certain neighborhoods, high-profile neighborhoods, midtown neighborhoods, where you don't have a substantial supply issue, I think the market will absorb that delta.
Yeah.
Because in effect, again, one key factor is IZ is not impacted to smaller boutique buildings. So anything less than 100 suites, I think it's 99 suites or less, is not impacted by IZ. So what you're going to have is where a developer could have a mid-rise building in Midtown, 120 to 150 suites, smaller and medium size, they're going to end up building 99 large suites for the downsizer community. So they can massage it to try and avoid the whole IZ impact where possible, of course. But again, those smaller projects, we all know the cost to develop is much, much greater on a per square foot basis as opposed to a 200 unit or 200,000 square foot project.
Yeah, and I know we ran some pro formas where we were looking, if you went down the affordable rental route and you looked at the differential in value between the assets at the end of the condo, what the developer could sell for versus what the rental in theory would be worth. In essence, each of those market condo purchasers has to pick up about $27,000 to $35,000 each as an offset to maintain the same profitability. And I think I agree with you in the large number of the areas this is going to target, i.e. the main IZ1 area they're looking at, that's going to be the route that the developer takes, is basically increase the market housing, which again goes back to, I think the point we made is this, that was never the intent of this policy. When you look at this policy, and obviously it's the old unintended consequences, I think we all agree inclusionary zoning is actually a good idea. We need more affordable housing. It's how they've put it together, i.e. there's no bonus density, there's no offset. What have you guys seen in other areas or other parts of the country where they've done inclusionary zoning? Because I think Vancouver maybe has, you get density bonuses and whatnot to offset it. And would that solve the problem with the inclusionary zoning is just that other side of the scale, maybe an incentive to help the developer make the pro forma make sense?
I wouldn't say incentive. It sort of offsets those additional costs, which anything like that helps. And with Toronto being void of that, I think there's a certain disadvantage. And I just want to go back a little bit to some of the other comments on the earlier interest rates. That we were already heading down that sort of slowdown on the condo res market. Prices remain high, and again, it's also based on the offset of the material costs. But the other issue that we're running into is that there was already a bit of a slowdown in the marketplace, and the interest rates are really impacting more of the users or the more of the end users of the condos. So they basically dropped off for affordability. But from an investor standpoint, activity compared to last year is still up, but it's heading in a downward spiral. So with all those other factors that developers are dealing with right now in the Toronto marketplace, by having some type of offset or an incentive to create the housing concept. And again, Marlon, I totally agree with you that it's in concept it's good, but having the proper tools in place available to the developers to help them get through all these other changes that they're seeing, not including IZ, but as well as the interest rates and the higher material and labor costs, and as well as that based on a bit of a slower demand from the buyer activity standpoint.
Yeah, and we've spoken a lot about condos, but to me, does this make inclusionary zoning on purpose-built rental, considering the challenges we always have, does that make any sense at all? Because couldn't you argue purpose-built rental already needs some sort of cost offset to make work? And we know municipalities are trying to push purpose-built rental, and they're not really making a whole lot of headway. We had the peak out, and now we seem to be dropping rapidly in places like Toronto in particular, and even Vancouver leveling. So other than Montreal, rental seems to be going in the opposite direction, less supply.
Yeah, and it's also reflective in the rental rates across the country with less supply, and sort of the catch-up rents based on the rents negotiated sort of pre-pandemic have gone up. So whether or not, do you think that the market's going to sort of correct that based on the short supply and the increased cost to justify some of that development and create a little bit higher returns? But again, over the last couple of years, especially with the owners of multifamily, it's a bit of a catch-up in the way of revenue lost in the last 2 years.
Yeah, and that's the concern I have is I don't understand the logic behind inclusionary zoning on purposeful rental at all. It seems even odder than on the condo side of things, in the rentals already struggling as well. So in 2026, I know there's a moratorium on it coming up till 2026, but even then in 2026, does that not just automatically render all yields really, really bad? And without any offset whatsoever. And obviously right now we're in a unique environment. Interest rates are going up. Cap rates are likely going to change slightly, which I think is the bigger concern. But I don't understand how all this math will work. And I know when we had the pre-discussion is we were talking a lot about the CMHC numbers as well. So CMHC came out with their report for anyone that hasn't seen it. And basically they looked across Canada. We're definitely short on homes. They looked in Ontario, and as this is a Toronto specific one, they basically said that we need another 1.8 million homes by 2030 to have any chance of affordability in the province, on top of the 600,000 or so we're already building. So basically we'd have to double, treble the number of homes under construction. So how does the federal government saying we have a housing shortage? Obviously, the province has got the task force trying to deal with this, and now we got the municipality constraining through inclusionary zoning. Surely there's a massive disconnect here between what each level is doing.
And again, I think that's always been the challenges with some of the new policies. The intention is on the positive side, but in a way of practical sense and in a way of the impact to the developers and how these projects are built, it doesn't make sense. And it is causing a bit of a havoc on the housing side, especially with that CMHC report. We're already going to have some challenges in delivering what we're sort of missing. And I think this pushes that delay even longer in a way of it's going to slow down the overall building process. Never mind, again, it's almost like a perfect storm when you get back into the cost, the labor, the interest rates, and on the price point. And now with the increase in immigration coming in Canada, it'll be interesting to see where people actually live, or where is that shift? Is a shift more into going back to your extreme of tents, but is the extreme of so the other secondary and tertiary markets that people have to consider, whereby for immigrants is a little bit more challenging because the lack of jobs in some of those smaller communities.
Yeah, and housing is affordable in Manitoba. Nothing against Manitoba, but it still has relative affordable housing compared to Toronto. So, John, if we go through what we've spoke about today about inclusionary zoning, and then we've just concluded we know CMHC wants to ramp up housing, the province does. If we're going to ramp up housing construction, won't that have the opposite impact on land prices in theory? In that if the demand goes through the roof and there's only so many sites, wouldn't that then, if you own a piece of land, it probably looks good in the mid to long term, even with inclusionary zoning, doesn't it? Again, theoretically, because I know when you do your stuff, you have to be sort of impartial towards that sort of stuff.
Right. And this is why I get asked often by clients, where do I see land values in the short term and the long term? And because of all these development and I'm just talking about the Toronto market for the time being, but because of all these development applications that have been pushed through with the intent of being grandfathered, there's more than enough entitled land supply in the condo format. This is not an issue for low-rise housing. We definitely have a shortage of service lots in the Greater Golden Horseshoe. Those land values are likely more protected than high-density land values. Because we have ample supply, in my opinion, and when I say ample supply, although we have the immigration coming, if there's a good percentage of that immigration coming in the next 5 years are going to enter the trades and help increase the physical ability to complete these projects and increase supply, then that might offset somewhat. But I think there's going to be a major disconnect from landowners today and land purchasers tomorrow. The land purchasers tomorrow want a discount to account for IZ, construction costs, higher interest rates. And the landowners today say, I have no pressure to sell. Why would I sell today just because interest rates have increased? I'm just going to defer my divestiture from this holding for another couple of years when the dust settles. And guess what? Immigration will be back. Land values will be up again. And we're going to be a bit more like Vancouver, where the land values for high density land in Vancouver are way higher than they are in Toronto. And it was a head shake a couple of years ago. How do you guys make it work? How do the developers work? They find a way to make it work. And effectively, the only way that it works is the market housing has to absorb the increased costs that the developers have to incur. And again, the developers don't make their 15 to 20 percentage points in profit. They're not going to bother developing. So
I still remember when we had the first $200 a square foot land transaction, and we had the specific rest. How can you guys underwrite this? And we had to do a lot of extra work. And nowadays, if you look back at $200 a square foot for that land, they'd have their arm ripped off if they put that back on the market right now. So
exactly. And from sorry to interrupt you, but from an international perspective, Paris, New York, Miami, London, we're still affordable.
Yeah.
We are still considered affordable. We're just not affordable for local Torontonians that are in the service sector that, don't earn more than $200,000 a year. So that's really the challenge. So I think as a city, and developers do want to help, they do want to provide more housing. I think we need the governments to say, no DCs, no CBCs, and try and give some real incentives to the developers to encourage, not discourage. Unfortunately, in my opinion, the IZ is a discouraging bylaw, unfortunately. And hopefully, who knows? Hopefully with the new mayor, it may get modified in the future, or new council. It may get modified in the next term. We do have a municipal election coming up. I know it's not easy to overturn these bylaws once they're set, but who knows what's in the cards in the future.
Yeah, we need a second look, a bit more of a collaborative approach with the development industry versus, and I've said this before, the baseball bat to the knees has never ever worked historically. So it needs a bit more collaboration. And the horrible theory we all worry about is that the government decides to try and solve affordable housing by building it themselves, which again, highly likely to be a disaster and cost a hell of a lot more than if we can just solve this problem in a collaborative way and more rational. I find if governments stop spending so much time all pointing at each other, blaming the next guy up the food chain for everything, and I recognize revenues are tight, but realistically, you got to deal with the overall revenue regime between property taxes and whatnot. Continually hammering development and new housing makes no sense. And I understand, it's an election. Councillor's going to get elected. He's basically got to keep the existing, everyone happy, the NIMBYs and stuff happy, doesn't care about the new homes. Then when he gets in, he can try and do some stuff. But the whole structure doesn't work right now, which we touched on in our affordability podcast. I think you're right. We need a complete rethink here and a bit more of a collaborative approach rather than this. Everyone assumes the developer's making a ton of money. Like some of these guys are making 10%. You go, 10% return. Yeah, it took 8 years to get the project through the whole cycle. So divide 10% by 8 years. All of a sudden, for the level of risk, it doesn't quite look as pretty as some other places could be. So I think we have some challenges. So it sounds like basically the conclusion I got from this is IZ's more of a mid-long-term issue unless someone corrects it. The immediate concern is around the interest rates, but inclusionary zoning needs dealing with sooner rather than later because it will be an anchor and has the opposite effect of what CMHC is trying to propose right now in the housing supply and obviously the provincial task force. Did you gents have anything else you wanted to conclude with?
Well, yeah, what I was going to say is you had referred to the accretive additional cost on the market housing. You had run some performers that worked out to 30 or 35,000 a unit. Well, that we can solve that issue right now with giving them DC credits on the affordable housing and give them a 10-year reprieve from property taxes or a discount on property taxes on those affordable units. Right? Why are we charging tenants on affordable units at 2% tax rate or a 1.25% tax rate? It makes absolutely no sense. So that would be my suggestion. Make it a partnership more so than just an offload to the development industry. I think the development industry has done a wonderful job over the last 20 years in Toronto. And because of that, we've grown and we're an international city now. So we should keep it going rather than try and kill it. That's how I'll end off.
You got something, Ray?
And we talked about this in previous calls. This is something that we've had for a number of years, and we know that is not a quick solution. But I just echo John's comments with collaboration and discussion and more communication between the different levels of government, because it's going to take a number of bold decisions and changes to change the direction with some of the shortage and some of the affordability issues going forward. But again, the challenge with it is that it was the IZ and now is the interest rates, and there's other factors you're dealing with it. And we just have to try to face this thing head on. And I think we're just having more and more challenges facing us with housing affordability shortage.
Yeah, and I agree. And I know I tend to be a little harsh on the city when it comes to this sort of stuff, but that's more sort of frustration in that it's just one thing after another. And I do recognize the city, the staff, they have their hands tied behind the back in terms of revenue sources, and they are trying to cover off budgets, but this wasn't necessarily the solution. And to John's point, I think the collaborative approach and the suggestions John had, that's the way we should have always done business in the first place. The IZ seems a bit of a disingenuous approach to things that basically was overly heavy-handed and ultimately results in the opposite. And again, we know of examples from San Francisco and Portland, this has been done. This isn't us just saying it's not going to work. It's been proved it doesn't work. So hopefully, as John said, some sober heads come around at some point and we see a different version of inclusionary zoning that sort of gets everybody what they need. So thanks very much for joining us today, John. It was nice to have a sensible person rather than being stuck with Ray all the time. And Ray, it was nice of you to come off the links in Calgary and actually pop into an office to make it look like you do some work.
I'm trying.
Okay, cheers, gents.
My pleasure. Take care.
Okay, thanks. So we'll just sign off for the day. The only thing we will mention is, obviously, we've got an upcoming podcast. Now, this one's super exciting. It's based on Back to the Future theme, and it's GTA cost escalation and volatility, the past, the present, and the future. And that's going to be with the most exciting person in escalation, David Skounians.